So you did the Sulzberg?
Good afternoon, everybody. You're great explorers to have found this room without any signs. Congratulations. And I'm delighted to welcome everybody. My name is Dan Gilmore. I'm co-founder of something called the News Collab, a collaborative lab doing experiments in mostly the demand side of the supply and demand equation in media. And in particular, what prompts this panel is to think about how journalists and newsrooms can do a better job of helping their communities understand journalism better and understand the news and how it works and why it works when it does, as well as helping the journalists understand the communities better than they do. And we have lots of work to do. We also have three real experts here. And I'm supposed to be kind of a speaker and moderator. I will keep my speaking short because I think what they have to say is much more important. Two of our speakers, Sally Lehrman on the far right, I don't know if that's true politically, but that's geographic, and in the, I would say, the center right is Jen Brandel from Harken. Sally runs the Trust Project. Jen runs Harken, founder and CEO of Harken. And Anna Massera, who's the public editor at La Stampa here in Italy. And these three people are doing wonderful work in their own areas. And my operation, the News Collab, is working with Sally and with Jen on a pilot project that we've been doing for the last year or so, working in 4 American newsrooms in California, Georgia in the east, Kansas City in the center of the country, and Phoenix, where the school is located. And we've been working with newsrooms to help them work with their communities in the goal being, again, to help communities better understand how the news works and how to find information, how to understand this basic stuff that we don't really teach very well, and, again, helping the journalists better understand the communities. And we've been collecting best practices in several areas that they work on. We've been doing some surveys, one national, several local ones. We've worked in the newsrooms on these experiments, which have gone incredibly well. And we're now thinking about how to proceed with that. But the people doing this thing on the ground are the journalists, with the help of my colleagues and 2 of our panelists. So I want to get straight to them. I think what I'll ask, why don't we just come down the row here, and Sally is the founder and just all the brains and effort behind the Trust Project, which is an extraordinary piece of work. She'll tell you about what she's doing, but she had the insight some years ago now to suggest that journalists could do something that was not really in the style of the past, which was to not only be more transparent, but to do something with data, by creating metadata information about the news organization that could help people make better decisions on what they were reading and how much trust to give it. Jen at Harken, she'll tell you again all about it, but they're in this area that we think of as kind of conversation in journalism, and more than journalism. But we at the News Collab believe that transparency, which Sally is doing in a profound way, And engagement, which is to say deep conversation and collaboration between the newsroom and the community, are vital as part of this process. And so we'll have them, and then our current practicing journalist is Anna, who I've known for a long time and who has, I think, great insight about how this looks from the newsroom. And so let's just start with Sally, and then they can each take a few minutes, talk about what they're doing, and I hope after they've spoken that you'll understand why, first of all, you should adopt what they're doing, and secondly, talk to your colleagues if you're in journalism about doing the same. So, Sally.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks for assembling us all here today, and thank you all for coming. It's, as Dan said, it is a little bit of a journey, so really happy to have you here. So, as Dan said, I founded the Trust Project, and it came out of concern, really, by editors that we weren't operating as well as we could in the digital environment, and that meant that our ethics were declining, our people's understanding of what we were doing was declining, the quality was even declining, because in the digital space, everything looks the same. And so we were trying to be like everything else, as opposed to trying to be distinct as we are as journalists, and being very clear about what is different and distinct about journalism. So that's fundamentally what the Trust Project is about. We are a network of news organizations. We are active very strongly in Europe, in US, Canada. We're also branching out now in Latin America and also Australia. So what we did was think about, well, how can we not only provide a clearer picture to the public about what makes journalism distinct, but also provide information to the algorithms so that the machines could do a better job of producing quality journalism, or surfacing it is what I mean. So we went to the public, and what I want to share with you today is less about the Trust Project and more about what we learned from the public, because there's another panel tomorrow in which I can tell you more about the Trust Project. But what we did was start with the public, because we felt like we've been talking about these problems for a long time within journalism. So let's really start asking people about what is it you value in the news, when do you trust us, and when don't you? And we went out and did that research, then we connected it with, we had senior news executives from all these different places come together and look at that research and marry it with journalistic values to kind of bring it back to, okay, here's what is distinct about journalism. So the things that people came to us about, and I kind of encapsulated in this story that I had about when I talked to a taxi driver who I thought was very conservative. He says, you can't trust the news, because, and I said, well, why? And he said, because it's controlled by big business and government. And then I talked to another taxi driver who's on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Well, you can't trust the news. Why? Because it's all controlled by business and government. So again, what we can do is make it very clear that our purpose is to serve the public and to engage with the public, as opposed to serving big business and big government. And so providing information at a meta level about who owns you as an organization, what your standards are, what your commitments are to the public, to public service, as opposed to other kinds of production of information. Being clear about what do you do about conflicts of interest. If you have, when there are business interests involved, what do you do as an organization? When you make mistakes, how do you correct them? What do you do when you get it wrong? Diverse voices, this was something that people asked about. How do we want to hear from people like ourselves and unlike ourselves, people said. Not just people at high levels of business and government. So what are your practices as an organization to get out there, make sure that you're bringing in people from a variety of perspectives? Information about the author. So who is this? What is their expertise? Well, how do they know what they know? What are they, providing more information about your news gathering practices as an organization and even in the story itself. And then what is this? We heard a lot from members of the public who would say, well, we can't, it looks like journalists are blending news and opinion, and we're not even sure journalists understand the difference. So one of the things that we do, and Anna actually is very helpful and instrumental in defining, trying to bring together journalists to define what do we mean by an article that says, we call opinion? What do we mean by analysis, news, and sponsored content or other kinds of paid content? And so as part of the Trust Project, we have shared definitions now that are applicable globally, and these are presented on the news articles. So now we are demonstrating to the public, these are the different distinct types of information you'll see on our pages, and all these standards are still behind them, but this is how they're different. And then the last couple are local. So there was a desire on the part of the public to know whether you as journalists, or we as journalists, understand their community, meaning demographic and geographic communities, and were we there? Do we go there, or do we live among them? If we don't, we fly into a place, were we actually there, or did we report from a desk somewhere in some other city? And then something that Jen's going to talk about more, I'm sure, is let me participate. So there was a much higher expectation of engagement, both on and off the page. So not just an ability to write comments, but truly wanting to be able to influence the direction of news in the sense that we know good stories. People would say, as members of the public, we know good sources, so let us help you. So those are the fundamentals of the trust indicators. And just in sum, I would say the key thing here is presenting to the public on your pages and as individual journalists, what are your commitments and practices that underpin your work as journalists, as distinct from information on the web that has been there a long time that might be there to sell you a pair of shoes, to convince you to vote a certain way, or even now to incite or anger you. So that's what we need to do both at the meta level on the sites and then also in our individual relationships. And the folks here on this panel all have an expertise in that. So I'm going to hand it off to them and then perhaps come back when you're ready.
Jen, why don't you pick it up?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Brandell. I run a company called Harken. The word harken means listen. And I want to just take a quick poll to see, raise your hand if you are a journalist. Okay, so about half the room. I'm going to ask you to pretend that you are not for a moment. So just pretend you're a regular person not having access to how to find great information. So if you are not a journalist, which is most of the world, and you Google something to try and figure out the answer to, let's say, what will happen to my pension if this vote goes this way? And let's say you Google it, and no trustworthy, good, credible information gets floated to the top because, like in Sally's work, there aren't indicators that this is good information. So what do you do as a citizen? You're there, you're Googling, you're trying to find something. That information doesn't exist. You have a couple of options. You can try and figure it out yourself, but if it's a complicated subject and you have a job and a life and a family, then you probably don't have time to do that, and you probably don't have expertise. And then even if you did have time, imagine calling up these offices in power to try and get them to answer your particular questions. Good luck with that. They will not have time for you because they need to hear from people who have power, and you are just a regular person. Again, not a journalist. So my company, Harken, is trying to help close that gap. When people have questions and there aren't good fact-checked answers out there for them, what do? Well, if your newsroom is someone who will listen to their questions and perhaps answer them, then they can ask your newsroom. So they might know that you cover economics or politics or sports. And when they have those questions, then they can go to you instead of Google when Google doesn't produce something that works for them. And yes, it's not instantaneous. You won't be able to put a reporter on it and give them an answer in 0.001 seconds. But you can invite them into the process and have them be part of your reporting. And what we find is that when people are involved, when they participate, they trust that newsroom more because they learn what it takes to make stories. They start to value the difficulty and the craft of journalism. And they get to see behind the scenes that journalists are just people, not the media, which feels like the place that we're trapped in right now, is being lumped as one full sum. And on the other end of the spectrum, oftentimes we can treat the public as the public and not individuals who have rich insights and who have a lot to share with us, but instead of, we look at them as data or dollars or demographics. And so I just want to give one quick example of how this can work in terms of creating that participation and that trust in those relationships. And because we're in Italy, I'm inspired to tell a story that deals with the mafia and statues of women. So just to make it thematic. Sorry to be very, stereotypical here. So in Chicago, there's a newsroom called WBEZ, or Z, and they run a series called Curious City, which I started there a long time ago. It was kind of the first iteration of this concept, which is now in about 150 newsrooms. And so at Curious City, this woman, Molly, had a question about gangsters and violence in Chicago. And she asked, and she got a great answer. She got to go along on the storytelling, learn how journalism works, be featured in the article. It was very exciting. And then her friend Kate learned that her friend Molly was in the news because Kate shared it with all of her networks because she was involved. And Kate said, oh, that's great. I want to ask a question. I want to learn how the news works. I want to get access to these people in places that I wouldn't have access to. And so she asked the newsroom, why aren't there statues of women in Chicago that are famous? The only statues of women in Chicago are figurative, like an angel or a dancer or something, but not actual women who had a historical impact on the city. And so Kate asked her question. The newsroom decided to take it on. Again, not like Google, so it wasn't instantaneous, but they ended up reporting the story. And in the process, they taught people how power flows in the city. They taught power literacy. How do statues get made? Who decides? Who is it up to commemorate some person, or man, really, everywhere in the city? And how can women be part of that? And so the newsroom taught the public how to be a citizen in this case and how to make action happen. And they also crowdsourced from the folks in Chicago, who would you like a statue made of? And they had tons of great suggestions. And lo and behold, because citizens now had this imagination around, things could be different than what they are now, and they knew how statues got made, they had everything they needed to actually do something about it. So 2 weeks ago, they started a campaign to start to fund statues of women in Chicago because of this story. And they actually had live women who were dressed up in all white as some of these folks that people had suggested around the city on pedestals talking about who they were as women to the city of Chicago. And so this is the kind of thing that can happen in terms of trust, participation, getting closer to the newsroom, and actually journalism acting as a service to the public. So that's just a short, quick story, but this is how we're seeing that participation can lead to transparency, that trust in relationships that is a net positive for everybody.
Okay. I want to mention, before we have Anna, that both of the projects you just heard about involve software development. And if you've been in that world, you know, I'm sure, that everything takes twice as long as you expect and costs twice as much. And it's hard. So one thing they solve for people is they bring to the table software that they've been working on for a long time and ways to put it into CMSs and other products that news organizations have. So that's one wheel that does not need to be reinvented if you're going to use this kind of thing. So Anna is in the world of being transparent and having conversations with the public, and it's different from her side of the fence, and why don't you talk about that?
Yes, hi everybody. First of all, are there any Italians in here? Any Italian journalists? Okay. So the fact that it's non-Italian audience already says a lot. I mean, we're in Italy, and you would imagine this place packed with Italians being interested in transparency and engagement. So we have a problem right there, which is evident. So I'm the only public editor in Italy, and I'm not even really a public editor from Margaret Sullivan's point of view. I mean, I asked to be public editor. I'm the one who asked for it, so now I'm stuck with it. But until they kick me out, probably, and it happened in America too. I mean, it's not an easy job to have, and I don't think that many people have it everywhere else either. And I talked a lot with Margaret Sullivan about the fact that maybe more than a public editor, I'm more of an engagement editor or a reader's editor, because the standards of public editing are very strict. Ombudsmen have, an ombudsman association. I don't belong to that. I depend from my editor-in-chief, not from my publisher. So if I want to criticize the editorial line, I have to fight with my editor-in-chief, and rarely does he want to publish anything that he doesn't agree with, so it's going to be very difficult. But it's important to have this conversation. I think we have to have the guts to fight in the newsrooms to get things better. If we are yes men, things will get even worse. And there's a real depression in the newsrooms. Journalists are depressed because sales are going badly, both in paper and online. Because, in America, people are being laid off. In Italy, we're not allowed to be laid off, but we can definitely be not incentivized to do well. They're cutting a lot. They're pre-pensioning people and not replacing them. So the cuts are so big that, newsrooms don't have copy editors anymore. And that makes it really difficult for me as a task to be a public editor because the corrections become even more difficult. There's more and more corrections because human errors are there. We don't have an automatic copywriting yet happening. Maybe technology will help us in the future, but so far, human errors still happen a lot. And so I have to correct afterwards by apologizing. I spend my day apologizing with the readers about all the errors that we publish, and it's not fun. So I'm in between, how do you say in English, a stone and a hard place, or something like that? Yeah. A rock and a hard place, yeah, where, the readers on one hand keep yelling at me because we're not doing well enough, we're not good enough, and the quality is lowering because of this incredible economic crisis that is hitting us, and because journalists being depressed are less attentive and they're less passionate about their job. They're looking for ways to get other jobs to make, ends meet. If they lowered our salaries 10% this year, and other newsrooms are having to stay home, once a week and without salaries paid. So, when they're not laying us off, but they're disencouraging us to do this kind of job. So I'm also I'm the director of a master's degree in journalism in the university. To cheer myself up, I hang around young kids who are really passionate about journalism. And I keep telling them, it's a really bad time for businesses in journalism, for newspapers, news organizations, but it's a really good time for journalism, so don't give up. Actually, you should be start-uppers, and maybe you'll invent the new business model or the newsroom that works, and we will come work for you. So you should be, if you're passionate about journalism, because journalism is really exciting, it's the best job in the world to find, I still think that, in spite of the fact that we're in a crisis. But it's just, this is a problem that we people from the analogic era are facing. But I think the future will hold. There will always hold opportunities for good journalism and for engaging the public in information, in good quality information, in trying to find the truth and trying to say what is really happening and trying to fight disinformation. So all these things, the trust, are you familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer? There's a trust barometer that comes out every year. This year, the Edelman Trust Barometer says, that people trust journalists almost as little as politicians and NGOs. Unfortunately, NGOs have come down also. And because of polarization and because of what politics has been doing to NGOs. So, and because how we have also portrayed NGOs in the media. So basically, people trust more CEOs of, managers, CEOs, companies. So, which is interesting. So it's up to the CEOs of the news organizations to try to fix it by raising transparency in their companies for trust. So I think the Trust Project is a great solution that could be adopted by all news organizations to try to improve the fundamentals of what we're giving and trying to help readers understand that there are clear indexes that we are being transparent and we are trying to be honest with readers and we are trying to be the best we can, and so to reestablish that connection that broke in these years. The problem, and the Trust Project is one of the. There's many other solutions that are trying to be put out there. So there's a real effort by different organizations to try to give newspapers the proper instruments. And some newspapers are doing, or news organizations are doing it by themselves. They don't know about the Trust Project, so maybe they're doing it by themselves. But the idea behind it is there has to be the leaders, I mean, the CEO of the company and the editor-in-chief of the company have to want to engage with readers and to really reestablish the connection with the readers. I mean, what is at the core of journalism? The core of journalism should be us trying to give our best to service. I mean, it's journalism as a public service. And the problem is, in Italy, I have to say, and this is a big criticism to Italian journalism, which doesn't mean to Italian journalists. I'm just saying in general, we have a bad habit of doing journalism, taking for granted that readers know what we are all about, and that they don't have to explain. So there's no explanation about our job. I think we should do a much better job at explaining. Readers have rights. I mean, they have the right not to understand something. They have the right not to know what you're talking about, to be ignorant about something. And they have to, I mean, there was just a great panel about history and journalism. I mean, a lot of readers are, you know, they never studied history. They don't know stuff. So they believe in theories that are, you know, that are fake news. I mean, disinformation. They don't know about the Holocaust. Some young people don't know about gulags. And so if you write a story about that involve having to have some basic knowledge, you need to incorporate that in the story to give texture and context to the story, to explain to readers that they maybe need to read more and learn more. You need culture to read a newspaper. You can't just read a newspaper and expect readers to understand it if they're not cultured. So you have to write in a way that even people that are not cultured understand. And that's a step back. And that has to, we cannot give information from high above down, top down, saying, oh, go and inform yourself. If you don't know something, you are ignorant. Because basically many journalists, that's what they do. They write a story in very difficult, language, like especially the economic stories that are difficult, or the science stories that are difficult. If you don't have a degree in economics or science, you cannot understand the story. They don't explain it, and if readers on social media say, excuse me, and it's obviously they didn't understand, the contempt of the journalists, on social media saying, well, you're ignorant, go back, to where you came from, and they start actually fighting. And so the hate speech comes up, and journalists engage in hate speech with the readers, so that's totally absurd. So not knowing, not remembering, not understanding, stories, I mean, we have those duties, and as public editor, that's what I'm trying to do a little bit.
Okay.
I have to stop, sorry. Okay.
It is difficult for newsrooms. By the way, Anna was referring to something for you younger people she was calling newspaper. You might have heard of that. That's an archaic form of media that some people still use. It is difficult for a newsroom of whatever kind of medium it is. If you're doing journalism, whether you're all digital, broadcast, print, whatever, there is the difficulty of not very many of you and a lot of people who are watching, listening, reading what you do. And I spent a long time in the newspaper business, and we loved the readers, kind of, plural, the readers, we love you. We were very freaked out by the reader, singular, who was sometimes really annoying, and of course was sometimes the best people of all in dealing with what the reality of our communities were. It's hard to do, and Anna raised a point that's crucial, and this is something we found in our experiments in 3 newsrooms in the McClatchy company, a US-based media company, that if there is support for these kinds of experiments for transparency and engagement at the top, that's crucial, but you also need people in the newsroom who are going to do the stuff at all levels of the organization. And in one case, a reporter covering city government in Fresno, California, took on a major conversational project. She said it was with an outfit called Spaceship Media that does, again, conversational journalism. And she said, no, I want this. I want to do this. And her editor had the brains to say, yeah, do it. That's great. And gave her the time. So this, you need there's a lot of moving parts in adding this to your work. I wanted to just mention, I think, something that's wonderful going on in Kansas City that Jen's company is involved with. And that's at the Kansas City Star. Harken, the Kansas City Star, and the Kansas City Public Library are engaged in a year-long collaboration that involves they invite questions from the community about really anything having to do with the city or the region. And if it relates to something historical, the city library, the Kansas City Public Library, they will answer the question. If it's something more current, then the news organization, the newsroom, will take it on. But in each case, and this is part of our work on this notion of news literacy and fluency, helping people understand how information works. They don't just answer the question, they explain how they found the answer to the question. And it turned out to be a real breakthrough. They're getting a lot of readership, and people are learning how journalism works and how library research works at the same time that they're getting answers about questions that lots and lots of people want to know the answers to. So try lots of experiments. Last thing I'll say about these kinds of things is that our Arizona State News Collab, we're working now, and we hope fairly soon publish a do-it-yourself handbook for newsrooms. And it will involve, first of all, saying here are best practices, and these two here are among them. Here are things to look at, here's some things you can try, and here's an approach to take. And having that newsroom buy-in is so critical. You can't just impose it from the top. It has to be people wanting to work on it. And the other thing is not everyone wants to work on this stuff. It's not, journalists have never made transparency and conversation part of their work until quite recently. So don't expect it to be everyone saying, hooray, we're going to all work on this together. Some people will resist fiercely, and that's fine, but bring people along. It's a great process, and I can't speak highly enough of how it works when you have partners like these folks.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, and then we'll get for questions here.
One last thing I wanted to say about this what you just mentioned is that journalists are not at ease with the request for transparency because there's a misunderstanding about the fact that journalists feel they have a right to keep their sources anonymous, to protect the sources. The whole story about anonymity of the sources is a story that needs to be understood by the public when a source needs to be protected and when it's just a lazy excuse for a journalist to not really mention the fact that there is no source, or it's just a gossip that's going around. So journalists really have to be clearer when they really do have a source to protect. They have to say it better. And they have to find the space in the story and say it. I fight with my colleagues all the time because a lot of colleagues who do, especially investigative journalism that really requires anonymous sources, and they get really annoyed when I tell them they should be more transparent about their stories. They refuse to do it, and they say, I'm a journalist. I would go to prison. I'd rather do that. They want to be heroes. They want to be seen by the public as heroes. They don't understand the difference. The fact that, there are heroes here. Next we're going to be talking with Maria Ressa here at 5 o'clock, and there are people who, are in danger and who are actually in a dangerous position, so they have to protect the sources, and they themselves are the ones who are willing to go to prison rather than not protecting the sources. That's a different thing. But mostly, it's not like that. Most journalism is not like that. So we have to know the difference. And the thing is that journalists really don't bother to see the difference. And that's a real problem. That's a disconnect from the public.
Think of transparency as who you are, why you do what you do, and how you do what you do. Those are the elements of transparency, and the anonymous source issue is the smallest one in that, but yeah. It's the one that leads to a lot of public mistrust. Do we have some questions out there, and do we have a micro? Okay, please wait for the microphone. Raise your hand. and tell us who you are, if you would.
Hi, Heidi Skjeseth. I'm a Norwegian journalist. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm very curious to hear, maybe from all of you, but maybe Jennifer in particular, how you actually managed to engage the audience, how you reach them and how you turn just curiosity or interest into actual engagement. That would be great if you could elaborate on that. Thanks.
Definitely. So with Harken, we have a methodology. We call it public-powered journalism. And it's called public-powered because without the public, these stories wouldn't happen at all. So it's not newsroom comes up with an idea, gets 75% done with the story, and then gets a little crowdsourced stuff and then puts it in. It's the public starting the story and the public really driving the reason for the story to exist. And so what we do is we help newsrooms traffic in curiosity, essentially. So we're not saying, hey, public, send us your story ideas. It's, hey, public, what don't you know that we can find out for you? Because as journalists, we have all day long to find out relevant information for you to make good choices in whatever capacity that may be. And so what we do is we help newsrooms collect questions, whether that's about specific topics that they cover, or if they're a geographic-based newsroom about the town or the city or the space that they live in. So a newsroom might say, what questions do you have about Perugia, its people, or the region? And then the newsroom here could collect those questions and fill those information gaps. And so that's just the very basics, is answering questions. It sounds so simple. It is simple, but it's very hard because reporters are used to telling instead of asking, and they're used to being in a position of authority rather than a position of service. And so it is a different dynamic. But there are a couple other ways that the public can get involved. A newsroom can curate questions that come in and then allow the public to vote. So that gives more people the opportunity to say, this topic is more important to me than this topic. And that allows the newsroom to be more relevant to more people. And then my favorite part as a reporter was actually working with the person whose question was being answered to be part of the story. So that might mean calling them ahead of time and asking them, who are you? Why did you care? Is there a backstory here? And oftentimes they became the best source. So not only do you get a great story idea, but you get the person who's going to be your protagonist at the same time. So it's actually more efficient in a lot of ways. And then they are part of that exploration process of going from not knowing something to then discovering and then having some kind of conclusion. So it's a really classic narrative arc that isn't built around conflict, but built around curiosity. And so that's how our approach works, but newsrooms have used it in so many different ways, from breaking news to investigative to topic-based and quirky human interest stories. But it's just really about having a two-way conversation. So instead of newsrooms being as good at telling the public what they should know, we want to help them get equally good at saying, what do you not know that we could provide for you, and listening. I think the muscle of listening in reporters and newsrooms, in the processes and the workflows, is the most atrophied muscle that we need to build in order for trust to be rebuilt as well. Yeah, you can ask questions. So our tech, we have a technology that helps newsrooms collect them on the website. So wherever a newsroom, whether it's in a sidebar, at the bottom of a story, in social media, connecting to a link so that they can ask questions there. We try to get people off of social media and into newsrooms' websites and with their email addresses so that newsrooms can own that conversation instead of the platforms. And so newsrooms can make money instead of the platforms. So that's how they do it. But then they can also do it just out in the world with a pen and paper at a festival or a conference or a meeting. So technology isn't the point, it's more the mindset shift, and the relationship is the point. The tech is almost like a dating app where the goal is not to be on the dating app, the goal is to be out to dinner with someone. So that's kind of how we see ourselves.
I just want to add something because, Jen is talking about this wonderful engagement on the ground in your regular reporting process. One of the things that we found in the Trust Project is there's an even more fundamental thing that news organizations aren't doing. So all those things that I described are called the trust indicators. These are transparency factors that newsrooms agree to display on their sites and also in their metadata. One of them in our best practices is just to explain, how do you contact us in the newsroom? And then we found that that's something that a lot of newsrooms don't, there's no person identified, there's no place on their website. If there is a place on their website, it kind of goes off into this unknown space, like you send in a form, you don't know who's getting it. So even, in addition to this kind of on-the-ground reporting, this is a key thing that we can do, is just provide a name, a body, a piece of contact information so that people know that we as journalists are interested in what you have to say as members of the public, in your comments, in your ideas, and in your criticism as well.
Questions here?
Thank you. My name's Dale Bechtel. I'm from Swiss Info. It's the international service of the Swiss public broadcaster and a client of Harken for the last 2 years, 2.5 years. I can recommend, not that I was paid for this advertisement, but it is very easy to use and a very nice kit. That leads me to my question, I think, coming back to the issue of journalists and whether they want to engage or be transparent. I think in the everyday in most newsrooms, it's more of a problem of convincing journalism that they have to do more than just write their story and wrap it up and move on to the next one. Because as editors, we put pressure on journalists to churn out enough stories. And so there's that tension between the quantity and quality. So we would like them to get out there, speak to the community, readers, whoever, have that interaction, help them develop the story, but at the same time, they're under pressure from us as well to continue. So if you have any suggestions or tips how to overcome that dilemma or deal with that dilemma, I would be grateful.
Yeah, I definitely do, and I'm actually going to quote someone who's in the room back there, Aaron Pilhofer. Sorry to put you on the spot, Aaron. But he was at a conference a couple years ago, and he asked a provocative question that kind of echoed around lots of people's thinking, which is, what would it look like if a newsroom were optimized for trust? How would that look different than what it is now? And I've done a lot of thinking on it since he provided that question, and so many others have. And where I've come down personally is that newsrooms were optimized for the machine age, where information was scarce. And so being first was very important. And, getting things in the containers on time to people's doorsteps, to their televisions, to their radio, hitting the clock, filling those containers, and what we call feeding the beasts was how everything was oriented. Workflows, hiring, efficiency, everything was optimized for that. And then in an information-rich environment or information overload, which we're in now, being first, doing more faster is not going to result in a winning ecosystem, as we've seen in many different ways. So instead, being optimized for trust means being optimized for relevance and relationships and listening, and that inherently involves the public. That if you're going to be relevant to the public, they have to be involved in helping to make those decisions, which means things might have to slow down, which means you might have to rethink, do we really need 40 articles a day? Can we get by with 14? And can we do them better? And can they be longer? And some news organizations are doing that. They're cutting back and finding that their readership is growing because people don't need more information. They need more relevant information. So that's just kind of, I guess, my 2 cents on it, but inspired by Aaron back there, who's on a lot of panels, and you should see him.
We had someone in the front has his hand up before.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for your presentations. My name is Jaroslav. I'm from Transitions organization. We do media literacy programs for elderly and senior citizens in the Czech Republic. My question is, we very often talk about readers, how to be more transparent towards readers, how to get them more engaged. But do you have any experiences, lessons, or ideas how to kind of connect and engage with people who gave up on news consumption, who gave up on searching for trustworthy sources, right? There are so many of them. And the question is like how the newsrooms can engage with them, even though they are not their readers or they might never be their readers, but still the newsrooms might have the responsibility to actually also work with them. Thank you.
I think the question is, how do we save the news industry?
Yeah, really.
Go ahead. I don't have a good answer to that one.
Well, I don't have an answer to how to save it, although we're certainly trying. I mean, everyone here, I think, is trying. One of the things that we found when we were doing our user research is that there are at least 4 different news user types. And so one of the things that we can consider is that we worry a whole lot about the completely disengaged and angry, but there are others kind of in the middle who we can engage with and bring along. So we did research in Europe and the US across people who are different gender, generation, geography, race and ethnicity, what am I forgetting? There was another area. And what was interesting is across all those different kinds of people, we found those same questions that I was telling you about. We also found 4 core reader types. So one was the avid news user who's out there reading everything, checking, cross-checking. They may not trust a particular source, but that's okay because we don't want just blind trust. We want people to be engaged, to be paying attention. Then there is the engaged news user who maybe is a subscriber. They're talking about news with their community, with their friends, but they are overwhelmed. There's too much out there, and they still don't feel quite served. They still don't feel that see themselves in the news or their communities in the news. And there's some uncertainty about what to trust. The opportunistic, that's a group who is just too busy to spend any time really following the news, so it's just there when it washes over them. If they're maybe at work and it comes on the television during the break, or when they're trying to get the traffic report and there's a notification. That group is probably the most uncertain, and then there's the angry disengaged. So what my recommendation, I think about how can we activate those avid folks to then kind of bring along each next level. And as newsrooms, how can we focus in on, one, kind of bringing the activated over to our side and the avid to our side, and then getting the engaged and the opportunistic more involved in public engagement on the ground, such as through projects like Harken, inviting them into the newsroom and explaining what we do. There's so many different opportunities and lots of good examples of what newsrooms are doing to actually go out there in the public library and say, here's what we're doing, we want you to be a part of this. And again, explaining, these are the fundamentals, here's how we are different as journalists and how our values are different from all this other information you're going to find out there. So that's my advice, is focus on the ones that are really the most open to hearing our story.
I think we have time for one more question. You can bring she had her hand up here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm from Austria and I work for a daily newspaper that is called Der Standard. We have a very big community. And as a journalist, I have to say, sometimes I'm really annoyed about them because they get us to what they really read, and what they are discussing most is if we have articles where we ask them about their sex experiences or what their cat is doing right now. So what would you think would be a good way to channel the things people know and to get better content?
You mean to get better content from the readers, from the public? Well, I experienced the fact that if you put on the website of your newspaper, of your news organization, so I keep saying newspaper because that's, but you work in a newspaper too, right? So if you put on your website and you share on social media relevant content that you think will make, that is more constructive and it's not about cats or about hate speech. You know, it's not clickbaiting hate speech and irrelevant conversations about cats and dogs and stuff like that, but it's newsworthy discussions that are, that help people understand relevant matters better, then you get relevant conversation. But if you put on the website also a whole bunch of junk, expecting, trying to get also the clickbait, because that's the problem, the contradiction of a newsroom is that we have the relevant journalists doing the incredible investigative journalism, and they're next to the cats and dogs and to the clickbait content on the same website, on the same page, really next to each other. We have a special column that the Italian journalists here know. It's on the right side of the website usually, and it goes straight down, and it's one junky story after the other saying, click me, click me, click me, because, they want the traffic. And if it's not there, they put it on the web, we put it on the social media. The social media managers are told by the company to socialize that because that attracts a lot of traffic, also on Facebook. And so that stuff we have to stop doing. I mean, it has to be a courageous choice that the editors-in-chief decide, you know what, we're not going to invest in that anymore. We decide to have, for something called media ecology, we need a cleaner, we're talking about the media, about the environment ecology. We should be environmentalists of information. I mean, that's what we need, you know? And so if we do that, we get rid of all the junk, and even the junky people who really like junk don't come to your website. They go somewhere else, you know? Because there is always going to be addicts of junk, but they're looking for, they just go anywhere there's junk and start discussing the junk. Just don't put it there anymore. But we have to have that courage. And unfortunately, I can't decide that as a public editor. I have to engage and try to, you know, to indicate to the readers that we have also very high quality content next to that when they complain about it, because there's readers complaining about the junk. But we're forced to coexist right now. And that's our dilemma.
I think we have people coming in for the next panel, and please thank our panel that are wonderful. And thank you for coming. Thank you.